Okay, let's continue on and talk about the ancient translations of the Hebrew Bible. As we know, in the kingdom of Judah during the period of Standard Biblical Hebrew, so from about the mid 900s to 586 BCE, in Judah, Hebrew was the majority language, although, of course, there were a variety of spoken dialects. Other Canaanite languages, as well as languages from outside the Canaanite language family, were also spoken in the region. Most prestigious and official texts were written in what we know as Standard Biblical Hebrew. We can tell this by looking at the kind of epigraphic texts, the inscriptions, the few letters and legal documents that we have from this time period outside of the Hebrew Bible. During this time, there was an active scribal community who worked in Hebrew, creating texts, educating younger scribes in a often fairly structured way, it seems like, and they had access to archives and libraries of Hebrew text. We remember in terms of history that the Judeans were scattered around the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 597 and 586 BCE. Some of them would later return to Judah after Cyrus's decree in 539 BCE, allowing them to return, but some of them are going to stay in the diaspora, especially in the communities in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Persia. Quite a lot of people chose to stay there. Now, what happens with the language situation of the Judean people after the exile? After some of the Judeans return from exile to Judea, Jerusalem is probably the only place where Hebrew may still have been the majority language. Most Judeans were living in places where other languages were primarily used for speaking and writing. Many of these Judeans spoke these languages, even grew up speaking these languages in the home, even also in religious services, rather than Hebrew. So Hebrew is becoming a gradually less accessible language. Aramaic was especially favored since it was the language of official writing in Mesopotamia, Syria, and Canaan under the Persian and Seleucid empires. Aramaic was very popular with Jewish communities. A lot of them would speak it. A lot of them who learned to write Aramaic first. And it was so important that even sections of the biblical books of Ezra and Daniel are in Aramaic. By 300 BCE, Greek would also become very important, eventually becoming the language of official writing in Egypt and the language of diplomacy and trade throughout the ancient Middle East. So, of course, we now have a difficult situation. Many of the Jews who were spread around the ancient Middle East could not speak or read Hebrew easily. However, they still wanted to worship the God of the Hebrew Bible. They still wanted to be Judean, to be Jewish. Thus, there needed to be translations of the Hebrew Bible into other languages. There are a number of famous ancient translation traditions. In particular, the Aramaic and Old Greek we're going to talk about more today. There are quite a lot of Aramaic translations of the Hebrew Bible, as well as commentaries in Aramaic on the Bible called Targums, as well as what you might call rewrites of the Bible, sort of retellings of the biblical story. These become a really important part of the Jewish tradition. The oldest surviving texts from this tradition that we have are from the 200s to 1st century BCE. So very early on, we have surviving a lot of these texts. There are also quite a few Old Greek translations of different biblical books. Some of these were later edited and compiled into what's called the Septuagint, but the oldest surviving Old Greek translations of the Hebrew Bible, they're not part of the Septuagint yet. The Septuagint isn't like a single thing yet. These texts are also from the 200s to 1st century BCE. Other famous ancient translations were made into Old Latin, including the Vulgate. which was largely based on the Septuagint, which by the time of the Vulgate had become kind of a reified thing, a specific thing. But the oldest surviving copies in Old Latin are significantly less far back. They come from the 400s AD, and these are created by Christian rather than Jewish communities. There are also a lot of other pre-modern translations of the Hebrew Bible, some of which are very important. Some of them manage to preserve older readings that haven't survived in other traditions. In particular, we have translations into Coptic from the 400s, Georgian from around the same time, various Gothic languages. You can think of like Proto-German is Gothic from a little bit later. Armenian translations from the 700s, Judeo-Arabic and Classical Arabic translations from the 800s, Old Church Slavonic in the 1000s, and Ethiopic in the 1300s. So these traditions are also in the kind of ancient to medieval periods. Now, if we think about how much is going to have to change when you translate from Hebrew into these different languages, let's talk about a couple of examples. What happens if you're translating from Hebrew to Aramaic? Hebrew and Aramaic are closely related on the grand linguistic tree of the Semitic languages. You can see they're here. So Aramaic is technically part of this kind of Aramean subfamily of Northwest Semitic, while Hebrew is part of the Canaanite subfamily of Northwest Semitic. But really, they're very close to each other. You can think of, for example, the relationship between Spanish and Portuguese or Spanish and Italian. They share a lot of their grammatical structure, so a lot of things about word order and where do you put adjectives, all these kinds of things, how do verbs work. A lot of this is shared between the two languages. They also share a lot of the same vocabulary. It may be spelled slightly differently, but most of the time, if you use a word in one language, it will probably also be an option to use that word for the same thing in the other language. Not always, but quite a bit of the time. However, this apparent closeness can sometimes mask important differences. Sometimes vocabulary words have kind of different connotations or different shades of meaning, or maybe a word that was the less common option for saying something in Hebrew will be the more common option for saying something in Aramaic. Also, some grammatical forms in terms of how the verbs work have somewhat different meanings, and a few things are in different orders, not very many. Here's an example. On the left, we have Genesis 12:18-19 in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew. So I've given you an extremely wooden translation at the bottom of the slide of what this is in Hebrew. And then over on the right side, I've shown you what this looks like in Aramaic. So as you can see, quite a lot of this is very similar. So the parts that I've marked in yellow are completely the same between the two languages. The parts that I've marked in orange are almost the same in the two languages. Usually it's just a spelling difference. So the parts that are different are the parts in white. So let's compare these and see what kinds of differences have we run into as we've translated this Hebrew passage into Aramaic. So we have here Vayikra Paro Avram. So Pharaoh called to Abram, Vayomer Mazot Asita Li, Lama Lo Higata Li, Ki Ishtachahi, Lama Amarta Ahotihi. So, and he said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she is your wife?" So, Ishtachahi, that she is your wife. Why did you say she is my sister? Okay. Now, when we come over to the Aramaic translation, we see that some things are slightly different. So it says, and he called me to him. And he said to me, so instead of saying, and Pharaoh called to Abraham, it says, and he called me to him. So we're in first person as if Abraham is the one speaking, and we aren't going to mention Pharaoh's title here. And he said to me, um, basically, what did you do to me? So in Hebrew, we had the zot in here. What is this you have done to me? In the Aramaic, we just have what did you do to me? And then it goes on, and on account of what um are you saying to me that my sister is she, and but she is being your wife? So there are a couple of things to note here. Number one, notice the word for wife here, anta. So this is a little bit different from our isha here. So the vocabulary word is a little different. They are still technically cognate, but they look a little different for one another. We can also notice that in the Hebrew, it starts with, why didn't you tell me she was your wife? But in the Aramaic, it starts with, why did you tell me she was your sister? And then it goes on to say that she's the wife. So it's reversed the order of these two things that Pharaoh complains about. So you can see they're fairly close together. There are even some words that are exactly the same, but there's some small differences. It doesn't really change the overall meaning all that much, but there are these small differences. Now, what if we're translating from Hebrew into Greek in our old Greek translations, that some of which will eventually become part of the Septuagint? Greek is a very different kind of language. It's an Indo-European language like Latin, Spanish, and English. So its structure is very different from Hebrew. So translating into Greek is going to have a lot of the same problems as translating into English does. There's different word order, verbs work very differently, there are different idioms, each language makes distinctions that the other does not. So all the problems that we have translating from Hebrew into English, they also had translating from Hebrew into Greek. Here's an example. So we've got our same passage again in Hebrew. And over here, I've given it to you in Septuagint Greek. What does this look like in the Septuagint? So we have in the Hebrew, and Pharaoh called. Here we have, and Pharaoh having called Abram. Doesn't really make a lot of difference, but they've chosen to handle the verbs a little bit differently. So he said, what's this you did to me? And then at the second part, we find, let's see here, Hatiuk, that you did not tell to me that your wife, so wife, your wife, she is, so that, why did you say that my sister, she is? So this is a pretty literal translation of the Hebrew. They've even kept the verb kind of coming first here in this verse in Septuagint Greek, which is kind of a little odd for this kind of verb, but they've kept it pretty close. But as you can see, they've had to change some things about the word order. They've had to change some things about how things are phrased. So you have to make some changes as you translate into Greek. Now, how did the ancient translators actually think about what they were doing? And what were they actually doing? We talked last time about the purpose of translation, and we said that the purpose of translation was to turn an understandable text or speech in the source language into an understandable text or speech in the target language, which is as authentic a representation of the source as is practical. We also saw that a variety of factors could impact the way that a translator would be balancing authenticity and accessibility. So, what kind of audience are they intending this for? What do they intend this audience to do with the text or to be able to understand about the text? There's also another issue, which is a lot of ancient translators clearly had varying levels of competence in the source and target languages. So you have some Septuagint translators who were very good at writing Greek, but whose Hebrew was maybe not entirely up to the task. You also have some people who clearly understood the Hebrew perfectly well, but their Greek was really weird. So you end up with this almost this very difficult to understand Greek because they're trying to make this translation, but they can't really write in Greek all that well. So this also is going to impact what your translation is going to look like. The early translations of the Hebrew Bible have very different balances of authenticity and accessibility, and some of them end up being quite different from the Hebrew text that we know. Because of this, scholars argue a lot. We're trying to figure out as scholars, what were these translators trying to do? Were they actually trying to make translations that were as authentic as possible? Or was this text not even considered a sacred text anymore? Was it considered more of a retelling or a commentary or something like that, where you didn't need to have that really high level of authenticity? How were they intending these texts to be used? Unfortunately, it's very rare for us to get a text in a context where it's clear how they were using the text. So, did these early translators view what they were creating in their translations as still being sacred texts? At what point did the different Jewish communities adopt these translations, which have this very, very varying degree of authenticity and accessibility? When did the communities start using these translations instead of just using the original Hebrew text, which was inaccessible just by nature of its language to a lot of the people in the congregation? How much freedom would an ancient translator have said that they had to adjust, to add to, or to subtract from the text before it would no longer be considered to be the same text? This is a big question that's much debated. So I'm going to show you something, and we're going to talk about what you think. We're going to talk about what we think about how authentic or accessible this is and what's going on with these differences. So this is the text that we've seen before, the Hebrew versus the Aramaic, right? So we see that in the Aramaic, we haven't named Pharaoh or Abram. And we also see that the thing that Pharaoh says, his complaint, it's reversed the two parts of the question. What would you think about this? It's not wholly authentic, right? We've changed the order of some things. It's not entirely clear whether not naming the people is because in the Hebrew text this translator was looking at, maybe they weren't named, or what exactly was going on. The fact that it's in first person, so he called me to him and he said to me, this does seem like a change that's been made to kind of tell the story in first person like this. Why would they do that? Is this an important change? Like, what would the ancient translator have said if you'd pointed this out and been like, so it doesn't actually say that in the Hebrew, so what are you doing? How would they have understood what they just did here? So it's clearly not trying to be 100% authentic in the kind of formal equivalence fashion where you go form by form. However, basically the same meaning is coming through here. Here's another example. Here we have the Hebrew and the Greek. So this is from Genesis 1. So the Hebrew says, in the beginning, Elohim created the skies and the earth was unformed and empty, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the breath of Elohim was fluttering over the face of the waters. So what goes on if you look at the Greek? So the Greek says, in the beginning, the God, so they added a definite article, made the sky singular and the earth. Because in Greek you refer to the sky as being singular, in Hebrew you always treat it as plural, so this is just a small adjustment. And the earth was unseen and unprepared, and darkness was over the abyss. This is kind of an important change. So in Hebrew, the darkness was over the deep, right? The ocean. But here, the darkness is over the abyss. This doesn't include the information about the fact that there's water there. It's just some sort of really deep, dark thing. And it's kind of tied into Greek understandings of how the world is structured. And the breath of God was carrying itself over the water. So we've lost that kind of fluttering verb. So what's happened here? We have this one change to abyss, which is changing from this more kind of ancient Semitic understanding of the universe, where you kind of start with water, to this picture where you start with like a deep, dark hole, which is more the Greek understanding of the universe. We also see that the spirit is no longer fluttering. Instead, it's carrying itself. So we've lost the bird language. This seems like a change for accessibility because in Greek, saying that a spirit is fluttering would raise some eyebrows, whereas in the ancient Middle East, that would seem very normal. So we've made some small adjustments here. Still basically the same idea, but we've kind of moved into a different cosmology just a little bit. Another kind of textual instability or textual change that we very frequently see, we find in lists. So, for example, if the Masoretic text says, and he would thrust it into the wash basin or the small pot or the cauldron or the pot, this is from, I think this is from Samuel, where Eli's sons are basically taking meat forks and putting them into the cauldron where the sacrifice is and carrying the meat away when they're not supposed to be. So we've got this long list in the Hebrew Masoretic text with these different types of things that maybe he's going to poke into to steal the meat. In the Qumran text we have that covers this, it just says the large pot or the pot. That one hasn't even been translated. That's just in Hebrew, and we've got a big difference in the list. There are at least 4 different versions in different Greek versions. So in the main Septuagint, we've got the large pot or the cauldron or the pot. In a different version, we have the wash basin or the pot or the cauldron. In another version, we have the wash basin or the large pot or the pot or the cauldron. In another version, we have the large pot or the cauldron. So you can see in this list where the details of what kind of vessel you're poking your meat fork into are not that important. There's a lot of instability in this list of what is going to be included here and how you're going to translate this. So this is something that you might see changes in. We also see that epithets, so the way that you describe a person, epithets can also be quite unstable between different translations. So we already saw this in the translation passage between Hebrew and Aramaic, where the Hebrew said Abram and Pharaoh, and the Aramaic just gave pronouns. So this is a pretty unstable thing that we see a lot in textual tradition. So, for example, do you refer to someone as David the king, I, or he, or the one being pursued? Like, how do you describe that? And maybe in different versions of the same text, sometimes they say David the king, sometimes they just say David, sometimes they say the king, sometimes they put it in first person, sometimes they put it in third person pronoun. You see a lot of this kind of variation, and it seems that a lot of times the ancient scribes weren't even aware that they were necessarily doing this. It's hard to tell, but it seems, given how widespread this is, it seems that they didn't really see this as an important change in the text. So as long as they still know who it is and the reader still knows who it is, they don't think it's really that important how exactly they describe the person. Also, do you describe Jerusalem as Jerusalem or the city or the holy city? How do you describe it? Mount Zion, there's also instability in that kind of descriptor. So what I guess I'm trying to say is, in addition to changes that you have to make as you translate just to accommodate the new language because it has different word order or different sentence structure or whatever, early translators also did accept some textual fluidity, some small changes in the text that didn't necessarily change its meaning. So they didn't see it as a problem to reorder elements or to change between third person and first person. They didn't see it as a problem if you change from indirect speech to direct speech. What do I mean by that? So for example, um, let's see. Um, and Elijah heard the Lord speaking to him, and the Lord was telling him to do this and to do that. That would be indirect speech. So Elijah is hearing God talking to him, but it's not directly saying, this is what God said. It's Elijah heard that God was saying this and that. You could also have it as direct speech. Elijah heard the Lord speaking, and the Lord said, I am the Lord your God. This is what I want you to do. That would be direct speech. So in these different translations and versions, we also see switching between indirect speech and direct speech between different translations and even between texts that are in the same tradition. We also have seen that lists can be unstable. They can become longer, they can become shorter. Some parts of the Hebrew Bible have a lot of lists in them. So, for example, there's a whole bunch of land survey material where there are lists of towns that are included in the areas of the different tribes. And these lists can look quite different in different texts and in different translations. They're all from the same general area, but sometimes people would pick different locations as important and as being in that tribe. Epithets, so the way that you talk about a person or a place or a thing, these could also be added, subtracted, or substituted, or you might just get a pronoun. So these are all types of variation that the ancient translators and the ancient copyists of the text don't seem to have had a problem with and may not even have recognized as changes. So if we look at different versions of the text, maybe we look at two ancient Hebrew texts, or maybe we look at an ancient Hebrew text and an ancient Aramaic translation, or whatever, most of the differences that we see are relatively minor. These kind of types described above that have pretty small impacts on the meaning. They don't change the meaning of the text all that much. In fact, so many of them are so small that when you translate into English, you can't tell the difference between what the original text had anyway. We even have situations where even these small changes would later be corrected back toward the Hebrew by later copyists of the Greek and Aramaic translations. So that's also playing in here. However, we do sometimes see more dramatic changes as they move between languages. So what I'm going to have you do after you're done watching this, there's an activity where you're going to compare a passage in Hebrew versus Greek, and you're going to tell me about what kinds of differences you see and what you think the ancient translator was doing. And then there's also a passage in both Hebrew and Aramaic that you're going to look at, and you're going to tell me what you think is going on there and why the story has changed the way that it has. So, just to give you a little bit more background about the Aramaic story, the Aramaic story that I give you in the activity is from what's called the Genesis Apocryphon. The Genesis Apocryphon in Aramaic is an extensive text that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's only one of many different kind of retellings of Hebrew Bible text. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have some actual pieces of a Genesis we recognize. So 20 scrolls with parts of the Hebrew book of Genesis. We have a Hebrew commentary on Genesis and a commentary on a specific incident in Genesis. But then we have some other stuff, some kind of retelling things. So we have the full Genesis Apocryphon in Aramaic, which retells the Genesis story. We have what's called the Book of Jubilees, which kind of reinterprets some particular parts. We also have what are called the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs. So stories about the events of the lives of the 12 sons of Jacob. These, we don't have all 12 of them, but we have pieces of the testaments for several of them, especially Levi, which basically retell events from Genesis. And we also have fragments of texts that are about the characters of Noah, Jacob, and Joseph, sometimes telling familiar stories, sometimes telling stories that we don't recognize. So there's a lot of kind of Genesis material among the Dead Sea Scrolls stuff, and some of it is like pretty close to what we know, and some of it is really quite different. So what in the world do we think is going on? Also, if we think about the Hebrew and the Greek, and the movement from the Hebrew text to the Greek Septuagint, the Septuagint does include some portions that the Hebrew just completely doesn't have, some stories the Hebrew completely doesn't have. Some of these may have been translated from Aramaic originals, but we don't have Hebrew originals for any of these stories. So in the books of Daniel and Ezra, there's quite a bit of material in the Septuagint that isn't in the Hebrew, and also in the book of Esther. So these late books have a lot of kind of instability in what people thought should be included in the book. So this is also really interesting. Now, how do we kind of understand what's going on with stories like the Genesis Apocryphon, which is fairly, like, it has the same basic events, but it's fairly different otherwise from the Hebrew text? What do you do with that? Um, these kinds of texts, which add stories or dramatically reorder and change elements, these are usually referred to as rewritten Bible. A lot of the stories that we get in rewritten Bible probably came out of the oral tradition, the sort of spoken tradition of storytelling about the Bible, but it's really hard to tell how these texts were used. Once again, were these considered to be translations, to be authentic translations of the Hebrew Bible? Were these sacred texts? Could you use them in the synagogue? Like, what would you do with them? It's really unclear how they were using these texts. Were these kind of to, I don't know, um, to get children into it? Was it to teach people? Like, what was the goal of these translations? Unfortunately, we just don't have enough information to know, but they are there and they're very common and they do complicate our picture. Some of these rewritten Bible manuscripts were probably not originally intended as sacred texts, but a number of them, like Jubilees and the Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, eventually it achieved a level of authority where they were treated as sacred text from at least the 200s BCE to the first century AD. The writer's ability to freely expand text based on the oral tradition or based on other textual traditions in other languages really impacted how translations were done during this period and how they were viewed. Later on, Jewish and Christian traditions have mostly discounted these rewritten Bible texts as not sufficiently authentic and have said, okay, not a sacred text, not authentic enough, but there were times and places where these were treated as sacred text. So it's interesting to look at these and think about how different philosophies of translation have been active at different periods and how that may potentially have impacted the Hebrew Bible that we do have. So, what should you take away from this? Ancient translators and audiences accepted a certain amount of textual fluidity, changes in the text, without considering this fluidity to make the translation less authentic. So if your list is a little bit different, if you've changed from third person to first person, they didn't really think that was important. That didn't change the level of authenticity of the text. They also produced a large amount of literature in the ancient times, now described as rewritten Bible. So this did impact kind of what they were doing and how they viewed the larger picture of translation. So you can go ahead and do your activity at this point, and I will see you in class. Have a great time.